What the Buddha actually taught about suffering. According to the Pali Canon, suffering does not announce itself as philosophy. It arrives as a tightening in the chest when something precious slips away, as a restlessness that no amount of achievement can soothe, as a quiet fatigue that settles in even when life appears successful. It is not always dramatic. More often, it is subtle, woven into ordinary days, hidden beneath routines, distractions, and small comforts. We learn to live with it. We learn to normalize it. We even defend it, calling it just the way things are. The Buddha did not approach suffering as an abstract problem to be solved. He approached it as a lived reality to be understood, not from a distance, but from the inside, with attention so gentle and so precise that nothing needed to be pushed away. In the early teachings preserved in the Pali Canon, suffering is not treated as a moral failure, nor as a punishment, nor as proof that life is broken. It is treated as something deeply intimate, something that can be known, traced, and eventually released. This matters especially now, in a world that constantly urges us to optimize ourselves, to escape discomfort, to numb pain with stimulation or identity. The Buddha's voice is unusually quiet. It does not shout solutions. It does not promise instant peace. It simply points again and again toward what is already being experienced, moment by moment. This is not a teaching meant only for monks, scholars, or the spiritually inclined. It is a teaching for anyone who has ever wanted things to stay longer than they did, for anyone who has resisted what has already arrived, for anyone who senses that suffering is not just out there in events, but in here, in how the heart holds the world. To listen deeply to what the Buddha actually taught about suffering is not to become pessimistic, it is to become honest. And honesty, when held with care, is the beginning of freedom. When people hear that Buddhism begins with suffering, many misunderstand. They imagine a worldview obsessed with pain, or a philosophy that denies joy. But the Buddha was not interested in bleak descriptions of existence. He was interested in clarity, and clarity begins by naming things as they are, not as we wish them to be. In the Pali Canon, the word often translated as suffering is richer and more nuanced than the English word suggests. It does not only mean pain, grief, or trauma. It also points to unease, dissatisfaction, instability, the subtle sense that something is never quite settled. This means suffering is present not only when life goes wrong, but also when it goes right. Pleasure fades, success demands maintenance, relationships shift, even happiness, when clung to, carries anxiety in its shadow, because it can be lost. This is not a flaw in happiness, it is a feature of impermanence. The Buddha did not say life is suffering in the way a pessimist would. He pointed out that whatever is conditioned, whatever arises due to causes, cannot provide lasting satisfaction, not because it is bad, but because it changes. This is a radically different framing. Suffering, in this view, is not the presence of pain alone. It is the friction created when the mind demands that what is fluid becomes solid, when it asks the changing world to behave like something permanent, when it tries to anchor identity, security, or meaning in things that cannot hold. Think of how often the phrase "I just want things to stay this way" arises quietly, maybe unconsciously. That sentence contains the seed of suffering, not because the wish is wrong, but because reality cannot comply. The Buddha's genius was not in diagnosing suffering as a cosmic tragedy, but in observing its mechanics with extraordinary intimacy. He noticed that suffering has structure. It follows patterns. It arises dependently. This means it is not random, and if it is not random, it can be understood. One of the most important clarifications the Buddha made is that suffering is not imposed on us from outside alone. While circumstances matter, the deepest layer of suffering is shaped by how experience is met. Two people can endure the same loss. One is shattered for decades. Another grieves deeply and yet heals. The difference is not virtue or strength, it is relationship. The Buddha spoke often of clinging, not only to pleasures but to views, identities, roles, and stories about who we are supposed to be. This clinging is subtle. It often feels like care, like responsibility, like love, but beneath it is a tightening, a refusal to allow life to move. Clinging says this should not change. Resistance says this should not be happening. Confusion says this is happening to me. Here the sense of me becomes central. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha repeatedly invites investigation into this sense of self, not as an abstract doctrine, but as a lived experience. When suffering arises, where exactly is the one who suffers? Is it in the body? Sensations shift. Is it in thoughts? They come and go. Is it in emotions? They surge and fade. What we call self is revealed, under careful attention, as a process rather than a possession. This is unsettling at first. The idea that there is no solid core to defend can feel like groundlessness. But the Buddha did not present this insight as annihilation. He presented it as relief. If there is no fixed self to protect, then much of our fear loses its foundation. Suffering deepens when experience is filtered through ownership. My pain, my loss, my failure, my future. This ownership hardens experience into identity. Pain becomes personal. Change becomes threat. The Buddha did not ask people to deny their humanity. He asked them to look closely at how identification magnifies distress. When pain is simply pain, it hurts, but it moves. When pain becomes me, it lingers. Another misunderstanding is that the Buddha taught suffering as inevitable and total. In fact, he distinguished between unavoidable discomfort and optional suffering. Bodies age, illness occurs, loss happens. These are not failures of practice, but the mental proliferation, the spiraling stories, the self-blame, the resentment, the refusal. These are learned responses, and what is learned can be unlearned. The Buddha's attention to suffering was not morbid, it was compassion. He did not turn away from pain because he saw that turning away only deepens it. He stayed with it, listened to it, traced it back to its roots. In doing so, he offered something quietly revolutionary. Suffering is not a verdict on life, it is a signal. It points toward attachment, toward misunderstanding, toward habits of mind that can be softened. This reframes the entire human experience. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the teaching invites a gentler question: how am I holding this? Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of suffering?" it asks, "What is feeding it?" This shift from blame to curiosity changes everything. The Buddha was careful not to shame people for suffering. He never implied that pain meant failure. On the contrary, he treated suffering as the starting point of wisdom. Only someone who has felt the ache of impermanence is ready to look deeply. Only someone who has been disappointed by craving is ready to question it. In this sense, suffering is not the enemy of awakening, it is its doorway. But a doorway must be entered, not decorated. The Buddha warned against turning suffering into an identity or a philosophy. To say, "Everything is suffering," and stop there is to miss the point entirely. The point is not to dwell in suffering, but to understand it so thoroughly that it loosens its grip. Understanding in this tradition is not intellectual agreement, it is experiential seeing. It is the difference between knowing the word fire and feeling its heat. This is why the Buddha emphasized mindfulness, not as relaxation but as intimacy with experience. When sensations are known as sensations, thoughts as thoughts, feelings as feelings, they lose the power to merge into a single overwhelming mass. Suffering becomes differentiated, manageable, honest. In the Pali Canon, the Buddha repeatedly returns to the present moment, not because the past and future aren't real, but because suffering is always happening now. Even regret about the past is felt now. Even fear of the future tightens the body now. Freedom, therefore, is not postponed. It is available wherever understanding arises. To truly hear what the Buddha taught about suffering is to realize that he was not offering a dark worldview, but a precise one. He was not diminishing life, but freeing it from unrealistic demand. Life, seen clearly, is fragile. And because it is fragile, it is precious. When clinging relaxes, love becomes cleaner. When resistance softens, grief can move. When the illusion of control fades, peace becomes possible, not as a constant state but as a natural rhythm. This is the first turning of the lens, Suffering is not proof that something has gone wrong. It is proof that something is being held too tightly, and what is held can be released, not by force but by understanding. Once suffering is seen clearly, the Buddha does something unexpected. He does not ask us to fight it. He asks us to look closer, not at the pain itself, but at what keeps it alive. In the Pali Canon, suffering is never treated as an isolated event. It is always connected. It arises because conditions are in place. When those conditions change, suffering changes. When they cease, suffering ceases. This is not belief, it is observation. What the Buddha identified as the central condition is often translated as craving, but this word too can mislead if taken narrowly. It is not only craving for pleasure, wealth, or success. It is craving for continuity, for things to be other than they are. Craving is the mind leaning forward, grasping, or leaning backward. Resisting, it is the subtle insistence that experience conform to preference. We usually think suffering comes from events, betrayal, illness, loss, failure, and at a surface level this seems true, but the Buddha noticed something deeper. Two people experience the same event, yet suffer differently. One is devastated for years, another grieves, but finds a way to continue with openness. The difference is not the event, it is the relationship to it. Craving says, "This must not end." Aversion says, "This must not be happening." Ignorance says, "This is who I am." These three movements work together, quietly reinforcing each other. They create a loop in which the mind keeps recreating distress, even when the original cause has passed. Consider loss. The pain of loss is natural, but suffering deepens when the mind refuses impermanence, when it replays memories not as remembrance but as protest, when it says this should not have happened, long after it already has, or consider desire. The anticipation of pleasure is often more intense than the pleasure itself. When the desired object arrives, satisfaction is brief. Soon, restlessness returns. The mind moves on, chasing the next promise. This endless leaning forward keeps the nervous system unsettled. Even abundance cannot calm it. The Buddha did not condemn desire as evil. He simply observed that craving cannot bring peace, because it depends on instability. It feeds on what does not last. This insight cuts against much of modern conditioning. We are taught that wanting more is natural, even virtuous, that dissatisfaction is a sign of ambition, that restlessness means growth. But the Buddha saw that endless wanting keeps the heart contracted. It trains the mind to overlook what is present in favor of what is imagined. Craving is not loud. Often it disguises itself as planning, self-improvement, even spirituality. Once I fix this, it says, then I will be at ease. But the finish line keeps moving. The mind learns to postpone peace indefinitely. Aversion works the same way. In reverse, when discomfort arises, the impulse is to push it away. We distract ourselves, numb ourselves, judge ourselves. We treat unpleasant feelings as intruders rather than messengers. But what is resisted does not disappear. It tightens, it lingers, it demands attention through force. The Buddha noticed that pain resisted becomes suffering multiplied. Ignorance in this context does not mean lack of intelligence. It means not seeing clearly how experience is constructed. It means mistaking thoughts for facts, feelings for identity, temporary states for permanent truths. I am anxious, I am broken, this will always be like this. These statements feel convincing, but under close attention they dissolve. Anxiety is a pattern of sensations and thoughts, not a self. Pain is an experience, not a definition. Nothing that arises stays long enough to be who we are. The Buddha invited people to examine this not to adopt a belief in non-self, but to see how the sense of self is assembled moment by moment, how it appears strongest when threatened, how it relaxes when not defended. This is why mindfulness is central in the early teaching, not as a technique to calm down, but as a way of seeing cause and effect in real time. When craving arises, notice what follows. When aversion tightens, feel its impact. When identification hardens, watch suffering deepen. This is not judgment, it is learning. The Buddha compared this process to tracing smoke back to fire. You do not curse the smoke,
You look for the flame. When craving is seen clearly, without shame or indulgence, it begins to lose its authority. It cannot survive sustained awareness. Importantly, the Buddha did not claim that craving could be eliminated through willpower. Trying to suppress desire only creates more struggle. Craving fades when its empty promise is understood, when the mind sees again and again that grasping does not deliver what it advertises. This is a quiet revolution. Instead of battling ourselves, we begin to listen. Instead of forcing change, we allow insight to do the work. The heart learns, slowly, that it does not need to cling so tightly to feel safe. The Buddha also recognized that craving is reinforced socially. Cultures teach us what to want, what to fear, who to be. Many of these messages are internalized long before we question them. Suffering, then, is not only personal, it is collective. Yet the Buddha always brought the inquiry back to immediate experience. This breath, this sensation, this moment of wanting or resisting. Liberation does not require fixing the world first. It begins with understanding the movements of the mind here and now. There is great compassion in this teaching. It means suffering is not a personal failure. It is a natural consequence of condition, and conditions can change. When craving loosens, even slightly, something unexpected appears. Space. The mind does not collapse. It opens. Pleasure can be enjoyed without being owned. Pain can be felt without being fought. Life moves, and we move with it. This does not mean passivity. It means responsiveness without compulsion. The Buddha's teaching on the cause of suffering is often misunderstood as bleak because it challenges deeply held assumptions, but at its core it is profoundly hopeful. It says, suffering is not who you are. It is something that happens when certain habits are in place, and habits can be seen. What can be seen can be released, not all at once, not by force, but naturally, like a fist opening when it realizes it no longer needs to hold on. When people hear that the Buddha taught an end to suffering, the mind often leaps toward extremes. Either it imagines a perfect state where nothing is felt, nothing touches the heart, or it dismisses the idea as unrealistic, something only attainable by saints removed from ordinary life. The Buddha taught neither. In the Pali Canon, the end of suffering is not described as annihilation, transcendence into another realm, or the destruction of human experience. It is described as cessation, a word far quieter than we expect. Not the cessation of life, but the cessation of life, but the cessation of misunderstanding. Not the disappearance of pain, but the ending of the struggle against what is. This distinction matters deeply. The Buddha never promised a life without difficulty. He promised a mind no longer enslaved by it. When craving ceases, suffering ceases, not because the world becomes stable, but because the heart no longer demands that it be so. The end of suffering is not found by rearranging circumstances, but by releasing the insistence that circumstances must satisfy the self. This release is often misunderstood as indifference, but indifference is cold withdrawn. What the Buddha described was the opposite. It was a warmth that no longer needed to possess, a care that no longer clung, a love that flowed without fear of loss. When craving loosens, attention becomes spacious, experience is allowed to arise and pass without being captured, pleasure is enjoyed without anxiety, pain is met without panic. Even grief, when it comes, is clean, sharp, honest, and able to move. This is why the Buddha spoke of freedom rather than happiness. Happiness, as commonly understood, depends on conditions aligning. Freedom does not. Freedom is the ability to remain open even as conditions change. It is the absence of inner coercion, the mind no longer pushed or pulled by compulsive wanting and resisting. In the early teachings, this freedom is not described as something added to the person. It is described as something removed, the removal of ignorance, the removal of craving, the removal of the constant pressure to become, to defend, to secure an identity in an unstable world. What remains is not emptiness in the nihilistic sense. What remains is clarity. Clarity sees impermanence without fear. Clarity sees non-self without disorientation. Clarity sees suffering without despair. The Buddha often emphasized that this clarity must be lived, not merely understood. Intellectual agreement does not free the heart. Insight must penetrate habits, reactions, and reflexes. This is why practice mattered, not as ritual obedience, but as training in seeing, ethical living. Mindfulness and mental cultivation were not separate paths, they were expressions of the same movement, reducing harm by understanding its root. When the mind is less entangled in craving, actions naturally become kinder. When identification softens, defensiveness fades. When fear loosens, generosity becomes possible. Importantly, the Buddha did not teach that awakening removed personality or uniqueness. People who awakened did not become identical. They became less constrained, less reactive, less driven by unconscious patterns. Their humanity remained, but it was no longer armored. This is why the Buddha could walk among kings and beggars with the same ease. Why praise did not inflate him and insult did not diminish him. His freedom was not withdrawal from relationship, but freedom within it. The end of suffering, then, is not a dramatic event reserved for the final moments of life. It is something that unfolds gradually, moment by moment. As understanding deepens, each time craving is seen and not followed, each time aversion is felt and not obeyed, each time the sense of me relaxes and experience is allowed to be just experience. These moments may seem small, but they accumulate. They recondition the heart. The Buddha never claimed that this path was quick or easy. He claimed that it was possible, that human beings exactly as they are, could learn to live without being perpetually at war with reality. In a world that encourages constant dissatisfaction, always urging us to want more, be more, prove more, this teaching is quietly radical. It suggests that peace is not found in achievement, but in relinquishment, not in controlling life, but in understanding. This does not mean disengaging from the world's suffering. On the contrary, when personal suffering is no longer magnified by ego, compassion becomes steadier. One can respond to pain without being overwhelmed by it. One can help without needing to be needed. The Buddha's awakening did not make him passive. It made him present, and presence, when free of craving, is powerful. The Buddha's teaching on suffering is often summarized, quoted, or simplified, but when listened to deeply, it reveals something far more intimate than doctrine. It reveals a way of relating to life that does not depend on denial, distraction, or escape. Suffering, as the Buddha understood it, is not a condemnation of existence. It is an invitation to understand how the heart binds itself, and how gently those bindings can be released. Nothing in this teaching asks you to reject your life. It asks you to meet it more honestly, to notice where you tighten, where you cling, where you quietly say, "This must not change," or "I must become someone else," and then simply to look. In that looking, something softened, not all at once, not forever, but enough to feel the difference between pain and unnecessary struggle, enough to sense that freedom is not an idea, but a lived possibility. The Buddha did not ask for belief, he asked for attention. He did not offer comfort through illusion, but peace through clarity. His teaching survives not because it promises perfection, but because it speaks to something universal, the human longing to be at ease in a changing world. If this reflection has stirred something quiet within you, allow it space. Let it accompany you into ordinary moments, a breath, a pause, a choice not to grasp. This channel exists as a place for that kind of listening, a place to slow down, to see more clearly, to remember that liberation begins, not with becoming someone new, but with understanding what is already here. If you wish to continue walking this path of insight and compassion, you are welcome to follow and return. May your seeing grow gentle, may your heart grow free.